Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about effective MAP policies and other pricing policies, everything you need to know. My name is Michelle Daling. I am the Director of Brand Protection here at Track Street. And with me today, I have Jean Zelek from Taft Law, Senior Counsel. Jean, I'll pass it over to you to get started.
Thank you very much and welcome. Next slide, please. We are indeed going to talk about MAP and other pricing policies with the sort of lofty goal of telling you everything you need to know, whether you're a lawyer or whether you're a business person. Kind of a lot to accomplish in an hour, but we'll do our best. Next. The first question is, okay, why do we even talk about pricing policies and why are they used? And the reason is what I call corrosive channel conflict. And corrosive channel conflict typically arises when you have resellers with different costs of doing business. And those that can offer lower prices because they're lower costs of doing business often do, particularly a phenomenon on the internet. And as a result, this causes prices in the market to drop. And in other words, they're eroded. The price that end users pay is eroded, which can cause all kinds of issues. Next. What often happens, at least in the stereotypical pattern, is traditional resellers. These are the historic brick and mortar resellers competing now with online sellers. They go back to the manufacturers and they demand better buy prices. They say, look, my margin is deteriorated, so you've got to lower my acquisition price. Or another alternative is they want more trade spending to subsidize their margin and maintain it. We've also seen cases where the resellers increase deductions to preserve margins, ultimately threatening to drop brands that don't provide them the margins they need and or emphasize higher margin private label products. Another issue is, of course, with online retailers, and as they've become more powerful, and COVID certainly helped in that regard, although they were on their way anyway, it's kind of their way or the highway. And those of you that have dealt with Amazon or Chewy and others know that they've got their rules and you've got to play ball with them. In any event, it's usually complaints and pressure from resellers to do something about price erosion that results in taking the steps that we're going to discuss. Next. There's something else going on here too, and that is the stakes. And what I mean by the stakes is, if you take a look at this chart, if you take the average resale price of a product, so again, this is the price paid by the end user, and we're assuming here, by the way, only one intermediary, mainly a manufacturer selling, let's say, to a reseller, whether it's a retailer in the consumer area or a dealer in the B2B area. If you take the average resale price of a particular product times its sales, in this example, it comes to $63 million, which obviously is less than the suggested resale price. That it represents the pie or the total value that's available. And then what's key is two things. First is managing the cut. And what I mean by that is the acquisition price that the reseller pays, net of all discounts, allowances, free goods, you name it, determines who gets how much of this total value. In this particular example, the manufacturer winds up with about $33 million of the $63 million, where the reseller gets $30 million. But the other thing that's significant is, since the cut is a bit beyond what we're going to be discussing today and really deals with trade spending and other kinds of issues and managing that, what's more important for what we're talking about today is this average resale price. If the manufacturer can get that resale price pushed up, it increases the size of the pie, and there's simply more money to divide. As an example, one of our clients that was experiencing price erosion did indeed put in a price policy that was very effective, and it wound up increasing the prices on its products to its resellers without raising, it wound up increasing the prices in such a way that it fell right to the manufacturer's bottom line. A very, very successful thing to do. So what it did was not only increased the size of the pie, but then it also adjusted the cut. In any event, we can spend more time on this later, but right now we need to move on. Next. So there's very common in this area, there's a tendency for people faced with resale price erosion to skip right to the very last alternatives, pricing programs. And there are some other ways to skin the cat that aren't mutually exclusive. So one is to selectively raise buy prices by channel. So we've seen cases where online people, pure online sellers, wind up paying more than brick and mortar folks. Now, part of this is tempered by the Robinson-Patman Act, which requires competing customers to receive the same price unless there's a good reason to differentiate. But this can be managed to make it lawful. Another one that's very common is to differentiate channels or even resellers by varying the product. Different names for the same product, different weights or sizes, different counts. So the online people get the 200 count bottle, brick and mortar get the 250 count bottle, or vice versa. Another alternative is to have different products or to segregate them, what I call BAMO, bricks and mortar only, which was used by one of our clients. So it had a certain line of products that were only available at brick and mortar outlets. They could not be sold online. Another alternative is price discussions. It is lawful to sit down with resellers and say, hey, you could get a better price for our products. You can't threaten them, you can't jump up and down, but you can have discussions. That's lawful. Needless to say, that doesn't always work. Another one is simply to call discounters. Some companies don't have formal policies. They just slowly get rid of anybody who's a discounter. I'm told that's the case with Rolex, but I don't know if that's for sure. The final alternative, which is what we're going to focus on today, are pricing programs. And they're of two types, either having agreements that affect prices that are charged by resellers, or unilateral policies. Next one. So what's the difference? Agreements require approval from the other side to implement or change. So this means that first you've got everybody to agree to what you're going to do. And unless your agreement allows for making unilateral changes, you've got to get approval from everybody when you're going to make a change, which gives everybody, even the smallest reseller, veto power. Far more powerful are policies, unilateral policies, which are really announcements that can be adopted or changed anytime. So it's simply much more flexible. So with a policy, you don't need anybody's approval. In fact, you avoid that. They are just announcements. And they work on kind of a legal fiction, which is sort of interesting, which is, hey, we're saying that you have to exhibit this kind of behavior. If you don't, that's fine. It's your choice. You can decide what you want to do, but then bad things will happen to you. An analogy that I've used many times, and undoubtedly some of you have heard me say this before, is it's like having a teenager and you tell her that her curfew on the weekend is midnight. And you say, hey, if you want to come in later, it's fine. Come in anytime you want. But if you come in after midnight, you're grounded till you're 35. Next. So another issue here is pricing terminology. And those of you that may have attended our last webinar, which I think was September 1st that we did with Track Street, we talked about sort of the alphabet soup of these things. And so some of the slides here duplicate what we talked about before, which is sort of necessary to set things up. But obviously there's other new material that you'll see shortly if you haven't already. But in the area of terminology, there's a lot of confusion in terms of what's what. And a lot of people talk about pricing policies as MAP policies, period, where it's much richer than that. So there's really two primary types. The first are minimum resale or retail price, what I call MRP. And whether you use resale or retail, it doesn't matter, it gets you to MRP. This is where the manufacturer has a policy that covers not only the price that's offered, but the actual selling price. Now, there some terms that you hear now and then, like MSRP and SRP, which stands for manufacturer suggested resale price or suggested resale price, have no teeth. They're just that. What they are is the kind of thing, if you're buying a new car and you see the sticker price, that's MSRP. The dealer is not required to charge that price. The dealer has flexibility to go up or down off of it. Similarly, if you buy a bag of potato chips and it's pre-printed with, $3.98, the retailer doesn't have to charge that. And indeed, Walmart consistently charges less than what the Frito-Lay bags are printed. What does provide teeth in this area are what some people call UPP. And UPP stands for unilateral pricing policy. And it's often used in lieu of MRP. But we think that that's not a very good choice because UPP, unilateral pricing policy, could also apply to MAP, which we're going to come to in a second. So we think the better term is MRP. And then a variant on an MRP is EMRP, which is a pricing policy that applies only to electronic media. So that would be texting, that would be internet, and so on, but not brick and mortar. In contrast to minimum resale or retail price is minimum advertised price, or MAP. This covers some offers, but never the actual selling price. Another way to explain it would be, in the online context, a MAP policy can cover the product page, the in the cart price, but not the actual selling price. So when you get to checkout, that's when the MAP restrictions fall off. So checkout can be any price. There could be magic discounts that fall from the sky or whatever. In the brick and mortar context, a MAP policy means everything outside the store is covered, but nothing in the store. So price tags, displays, flyers handed out at the door, none of that is covered. But newspaper advertising, television advertising, billboards, certainly internet, that's all covered. Variants on MAP are IMAP and EMAP. IMAP stands for Internet Minimum Advertised Price. We prefer EMAP, Electronic Minimum Advertised Price. And the reason for that is we usually, with an EMAP policy, we cover more than just the internet. We do want to cover texting and other forms of conveying prices electronically. Next. So if you're going to adopt a policy, and let's take a half a step back here. Some of you on this webinar have existing policies. So we usually approach this from the point of view either adopting a policy, you haven't had one before, or modifying the one you have to make it work better. The process is essentially the same. So the essential pieces are really fivefold. The first is you have to start with the philosophy and foundation. You follow that with diagnosing the problem, then designing the policy, implementing and enforcing it, and finally analysis and adjustment. Next. So on the philosophy front, the goal is to have a strong, clear policy with sting. And what I mean by sting is the penalties have to be meaningful and you have to enforce them, but they have to be meaningful because you want something that we lawyer types call the chilling effect. And the chilling effect is you really don't want to have to go around and enforce your policy. What you want is people to read it and understand that they're going to get hurt if they don't play ball. So you want them to behave. That's called the chilling effect. They're chilled from violating the policy. And that's really your goal. You want them to obey. You don't want to have to enforce, you want the policy to be followed. And this requires commitment on the part of the company. And by commitment, we usually say, never put anything in place you're not prepared to enforce with your biggest customer. We have plenty of clients, I've seen it, Michelle's seen it, that they get weak-kneed when it comes time to enforcing it. And what finally happens is their policies fall apart because they simply have no teeth. Now, it's a big step. It's easier for us on the outside to say, oh, gee, Walmart's violating, cut off Walmart, when there's a lot of money at issue. But you need some kind of meaningful penalty. And by the way, cutoff isn't necessarily required. We'll come to that in a minute. But you need some kind of meaningful penalty. Otherwise, there's no disincentive on the part of the reseller to play ball. So you also need a foundation internally. You need an internal champion, somebody who's really behind this and is going to make it happen. And it's usually a business person. You need senior management backing. The last thing you want to do is set up a policy and have senior management undercut it by cutting side deals. And this necessarily requires a team within the company to pull this off, usually involving various areas that are affected, whether it be marketing, sales, finance, legal, and whatever. And then also sometimes necessary outside support, whether it be outside lawyers like me or outside price monitoring services like TrackStreet that support the function. Next. Diagnosis. I can't emphasize this enough. There's a tendency on the part of a lot of companies just to immediately say, oh, we need a MAP policy. And you want to say, really? And I think it's more important to stand back and say, what's the problem? Now, price erosion is probably the answer, but what products are involved? Everything or just some products? Where does the problem occur? Is it in all parts of the country or some parts of the country? Does it occur at the at which level? And we'll come to that in a second. Are there contracts involved or state protection laws? If a manufacturer is subject to vendor agreements that say you can't stop doing business with me except on 90 days notice, that may make it very difficult to enforce a policy that requires immediate penalties of one kind or another. Are there state protection laws? Now, generally in the consumer area, there really aren't any state protection laws, but in certain industries like motor vehicles, or sometimes in very broad categories, such as the case in the state of Wisconsin, there are strong reseller protection laws that would pose some difficulty in just cutting people off for violating your policy. So you need to cope with that. An important issue is, how does a supplier sell in each relevant channel? Do they sell one step, that is one intermediary, usually just a reseller, or do they sell two-step, two intermediaries? They sell to distributors or wholesalers and resellers. I think our experience has been, in many cases, it's usually two-step at least, if not more steps. And you can still have policies, it's just they become a little bit more complex. And a big one that a lot of people have trouble looking in the mirror over is, do the supplier's trade spending or sales practices contribute to the problem? So in other words, are we the enemy? Because we encourage things by having big price fluctuations. We encourage buyouts, then we encourage people to dump product on the market at low prices or whatever. Do we need to adjust that kind of behavior so we're not encouraging that which we're trying to stop? Next. So then you get to policy design. Next. So as I mentioned, we want a pragmatic, customized approach. And so the first question is the applicable levels. Is this the policy going to apply at the wholesaler distributor level, at the reseller, or both? Usually when you want to cover both, they're two separate policies. They read similarly, but obviously the price points that you set for wholesalers are different than what you set for resellers. The next question is, it MAP or MRP? And so you say, how far do we want to go? What do we need to do? There's a tendency on the part of some companies to say, well, we'll do MAP, and if that doesn't work, then we'll ramp it up and do MRP. I don't think we've ever seen that happen. Usually people just stay with whatever they start with. And we've also seen some industries tend to be focus on MAP versus MRP. I'd say MAP is more prevalent in the consumer packaged goods area. With respect to apparel clients that we have, they tend to go with MRP, and others it's a bit of a mix, and it really depends. And the automotive aftermarket, for example, we've done both. I'd say probably more MRP than MAP. And then, or is a variant more important here? Are we really just concerned about electronic pricing? And let's pause for a second. Why is electronic pricing so important? Because of the transparency. So one of the things the internet introduced is incredible pricing transparency, and that's really what's driving the resale price erosion, among other things, in many cases, not in all cases. So sometimes companies say, hey, we don't care about brick and mortar. Let's just focus on internet pricing or electronic pricing. So EMAP or EMRP may be fine. Then we've done a range of hybrids that just shows you that the goal here is customization to make sure you get the product that works. But we've done policies that combine MRP and MAP, where some clients, when we in particular was a manufacturer of electronics, and it said the crown jewels we want protected by MRP. Those products that are a little longer in the tooth will be covered by MAP. And then some things like maybe cabling or related kinds of things, which are really commodities, we don't care. And the goal was things would start with MRP, and then over a period of time, they might move to MAP and then ultimately not be protected. We have a client in the household products area that liked MAP and promo MAP. And so we set up a MAP policy, but we said at certain times of the year on the following products, not necessarily all the products covered, there could be promo MAP, which was a discount off of that, but it could only be offered at particular times and only for a certain period. Actually, as I think about it, we've done that for at least 2 clients in that area. And then another one that has evolved is MAPs or MRPs or MAPs that vary. That is, clients want to set one MAP or MRP for online versus brick and mortar. Or stage of the buy process. We've had some clients that say, hey, we want one MAP or MRP for the product page, and we want another one in the cart. And then one of the more innovative ones we've seen is we have a client that went to its retailers and said, look, you have to elect whether you want to be EDLP, that's everyday low price, and that would be commonly somebody like Walmart, or high-low, somebody like Publix or Safeway or whatever. The difference being EDLP means there are few, if any, sales. It's just an everyday low price. Where the high-low people, they offer a daily price that's higher, but then there's often promotions that are run. Anyway, I went to its retailers and said, you have to do elect. You're either EDLP or high-low. And the significance of that is that the minimum price for EDLP, let's say, is $12.99. And for high-low, the minimum price was $14.99. But the high-low people were allowed twice per year to go down to $11.99. And by the way, if the retailer did not make the election within the time, it got put in one category or the other automatically based on what the manufacturer thought was best. Next. So what are the legal standards for pricing policies? Pricing agreements, which actually I don't think we've ever done a pricing agreement, but the law says that if you're going to do a MAP agreement, this is not a unilateral policy, this is an agreement. And let me just pause there. One of the ways you can wind up with an agreement when you think you have a policy, and we see this all the time, people will issue what they think is a unilateral policy, and then they'll have a contract that says, as part of our contract, you have to follow all of our policies. Once you do that, you now have an agreement on a MAP or MRP. But there are some people, I may still be using agreements, not necessarily inadvertently, but on purpose. The law is favorable, however. If you have a MAP agreement, it's governed by something called the rule of reason at the federal and state levels in the United States. We'll talk about what the rule of reason means in a minute. But with respect to MRP, if you have an agreement setting a minimum resale price or minimum retail price, most states is the rule of reason, but 5 states say that under their laws, it's always illegal or unenforceable to do a MRP agreement. And those 5 states are California, New York, Illinois, Michigan, and Maryland. As a result, unilateral pricing policies are favored, but the law there is they're not covered by the price fixing laws at all. So even in those 5 states that don't like agreements, policies are perfectly okay. They're simply not covered by the price fixing laws. So they're the first choice for MAP or MRP programs. So MAP, to recap, a MAP agreement, rule of reason every place. And the rule of reason, as we'll see in a minute, is very favorable towards manufacturers. MRP, you got a problem in 5 states. But regardless of that, a unilateral policy with MAP or MRP is much more favorable because, as I mentioned before, you can change it anytime you feel like it. You don't need to get approval. It's simply a lot more flexible, and it's bulletproof in every state. So that's why it's the first choice for MAP or MRP programs. Next. So why are policies treated differently? Why is this big out? Well, the primary U.S. Anti-price fixing statute is Section 1 of the Sherman Act. And it says every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint or trade is hereby declared to be illegal. The language in red is key: contract, combination, or conspiracy. The bottom line is Section 1 of the Sherman Act does not apply unless you have an agreement of some kind, because that's what a contract, combination, or conspiracy is. Absent an agreement, that is, when you have a unilateral policy, it's simply not covered by the statute. And this is true not only with respect to the Sherman Act, it's true with respect to the Federal Trade Commission Act, Section 5, and it's true in every state. So that's why policies are treated more differently, and that's why they're so potent. Next. But wait a minute, isn't every pricing agreement illegal? Because the statute again says every contract, combination, or conspiracy. Next. Well, since this is the law, every doesn't mean every. So the courts have evolved the standard over a period of time to say that we treat agreements that are being scrutinized for antitrust purposes under 2 tests. The first is something called per se treatment. And this assumes that what is the conduct at issue is always illegal. So you just have to prove it exists and you've won your case. And damages, I suppose, is the other thing. However, the trend in US law for the last 45 years or so has been adopting the rule of reason. And the rule of reason requires demonstrable economic effect. it starts with the presumption that the behavior is lawful and requires whoever's challenging it to prove that on balance it's unreasonably anti-competitive. Next one. So the rule of reason, as I said, well, it requires demonstrable economic effect. It starts, unlike the per se test, which is it presumes it's illegal, it starts with a presumption of legality, meaning that, again, it's on the challenger's shoulders to show otherwise. And there's a balancing test, taking a look at the pro-competitive benefits and the anti-competitive detriments, and it gives the party that's challenged an opportunity to defend. The bottom line is that rule of reason cases are expensive and time-consuming to win, and there are many fewer of them. Plaintiffs' lawyers and the government likes the per se test because they're much easier to apply and much easier to win. A per se, by the way, is primarily reserved for things like horizontal price fixing conspiracies. That is where competitors get in the stereotypical smoke-filled room and set prices. Next. So what about Canada and Mexico? Both places say we don't care whether it's MAP or MRP, the rule of reason applies. And we also don't care whether it's an agreement or done by policies, it gets the same treatment. But again, because of the flexibility implicit in policies, it's still a much better approach than doing this by agreement, even though you have more latitude in places like Canada. By the way, North America is really kind of an outlier. Many of you are undoubtedly aware that in most places in the world, trying to do anything with resale price, whether even MAP or MRP, is illegal on its face. So North America is really an outlier. Most of the work that we do is in Canada and the US for obvious reasons. Next. So another issue when you're designing your policy is, well, what are the penalties for violations? So one of the first ones is, hey, maybe I don't want to just cut somebody off because they're Walmart and they're going to cost me millions of dollars in sales. So you can have financial penalties. And ones we've seen are loss of accrued trade funds and no additional accrual during a penalty period. And that penalty period could be 30, 60, 90 days. But by the way, most penalties are stair-stepped, meaning that for the first violation, it's often we'll send you notice and you get a period to take it down. If you take it down within the time we set, nothing happens to you, but you've accrued one violation. And then the second violation, which could be a result from the failure to cure the first one or a whole new violation, results in something that's more, it cuts into the bone a bit more, such as these financial penalties that we're talking about and some of these other ones. And then in a 3-strike and you're out program, the third strike would be a cutoff of some kind or another. In any event, so the first alternative is financial. As I mentioned, loss of accrued trade funds, no additional accrual during the penalty period. So for second violation, it might be for 30, 60, 90 days. Another is a loss of an implicit discount. Implicit in our price to you is a 5% discount for advertising and marketing. If you violate our policy, you lose the implicit discount, which means your acquisition price during the next 30, 60, 90 days goes up by 5% or 10% or whatever you want to make it. Another one is loss of product access during the penalty period. We've had some clients that go with an allocation percentage. So they said, if you, whatever you bought from us last year, will only allow you to buy up to 50% of that during the penalty period because of the second violation, or a complete cutoff for 30, 60, 90 days. We don't allow you to buy. And this can apply to just a single SKU or a product family or everything in the line. Sometimes SKUs are too narrow. They really don't provide much disincentive. We have one client in the electronics area that a single SKU was an orange one, but the violator could still buy the green ones, the blue ones, the yellow ones, and the white ones. So we came up with the concept of a product family, which would be that we can say all SKUs within this particular heading that you deny access or you lose your trade dollars or whatever. Sometimes it is everything. Again, we're looking for leverage here. And sometimes we have clients that like a combination. They like to pick and choose between financial penalties and loss of access. And we can set it up that way, that works. But the ultimate penalty is always loss of product access. This is consistent with the primary case in the area. It's actually a Supreme Court case that goes back to 1919 called Colgate. And the ultimate penalty is the loss of product access. So it could be for the third violation, or in a four strike and you're out scenario, it could be for the fourth violation, that the violator loses access to the SKU, it loses access to a product family, or everything. We typically write it for an undefined period of time. In other words, for an indefinite period of time. Why? Because we want them to really believe that they've blown it and they're never going to see this product again. That having been said, as many of our clients point out, hey, we're in the business to sell products, not cut people off. The manufacturer can reinstate anybody it feels like, while not reinstating others. So it may decide that after 30, 60, 90 days of being cut off, that particular reseller's learned its lesson, and so it turns it back on, again, subject to the policy. Another reseller that it believes has not learned its lesson or simply shouldn't be handling the product. We don't like the way they deal. We don't like the way they conduct themselves. We never reinstate them, and that's perfectly okay. That's because there's no legal requirement, absent a contract, that you have to sell your products to anybody who wants it. Next. Other policy details. What's the timing? When is it going to be effective? When are you rolling it out? Or is there going to be a ramp-up period where you tell people it's going to be effective in 30 days to give them a chance to conform behavior? A big one, which is really something we lawyers don't get involved in much, is setting the minimum price. This is really an art form, and it's really something that the business people you have to figure out. You set the price too high and you're going to lose sales. You set the price too low and you're leaving money on the table. So what's that sweet spot? Where does it need to be? What products are covered? All products or just some products? What are the violation penalties? What about resetting the clock? And by resetting the clock, we have clients who say, oh, well, I'll give you an example. There's a plumbing products company that is not a client of ours that has a IMAP or EMAP policy, and it resets the clock every 18 months. What does that mean? That means if you're a reseller and you're coming up at the end of an 18-month period, you violate the heck out of the policy because you know in 2 weeks all violations will be forgiven. We think resetting the clock is a dumb thing to do, and to put it into the policy. That having been said, if a manufacturer wants to declare an amnesty period or wipe the slate clean, it can do so, but I never would put that in the policy. Cheat proofing, what are ways that people can kind of get around and play games? One is bundling, and there's a variety of other ways to cheat. You want to build in some of those things and or build in disincentives to do those kinds of things, or channel them in certain areas. And the question is, what does the manufacturer feel strongly about, both positively and negatively? And those should be incorporated in the policy. We don't want ambiguity. Some people think a half-page policy that just says, lots of things are in the open, that doesn't really provide much guidance. That also requires a lot of hand-holding and also perhaps too much discretion. What about approved freebies? Free shipping is so common that that's usually included, so that doesn't count as a discount. What are exemptions? Things that we allow for. Target has a proprietary credit card called a red card. It provides a 5% discount. Do you want to allow that? That would be probably effectively give a 5% discount from MAP or MRP. And most people say, hey, if I want to sell Target, I've got no choice. So then we carve that into it as an exception. We designate a policy administrator, a single person, whether he or she is identified by name or just by office, that runs the policy, usually somebody within the sales organization, not a salesperson, but somebody within the sales organization, usually sales administrator or whatever, who tracks violations and sends out violation notices and the like, and then what other restrictions should be included in the policy. Next. Additional materials that often cover policies, distribution or reseller agreements or policies. It's really important, and a lot of people miss this point. They think they do a MAP or MRP policy and the world's a better place. But part and parcel of that is you've got to be able to control distribution. For manufacturers that sell to anybody with a pulse, no wonder their product is discounted and they just simply can't get a lid on it. I mean, unauthorized resellers have no incentive to follow your policy. What are you going to do? Cut them off? They're not supposed to have the product anyway. So getting some kind of handle on distribution and being very careful who gets your products. Now, with some, it's easier said than others. So so-called durables, consumer durables like refrigerators and television sets and things like that, they've always used more of a selective distribution model, where consumer packaged goods companies, which, by the way, there's been a tremendous growth in that area, wanting to do policies. CPG companies typically want their product like every place. Think Wrigley's gum wants to be every place. So the idea of controlling distribution is kind of alien to them, but I still maintain, maybe they don't have to control it as tightly as others do, there's still some people who shouldn't have your product, and culling those will make it a lot easier to enforce your policy later. Other materials that typically accompany a policy would be a cover letter or email explaining it, maybe FAQs, some internal guidance, a memo. Some of our clients have had us do something called a Miranda card, which is it just tells the salespeople you're not to talk about the policy. Any questions, comments, or concerns, refer the person with the questions to the policy administrator. And then violation notices. We usually do templates that make it easier for the policy administrator just to fill in the blanks and send them out. They correspond to what's in the policy. Some people like the idea, particularly when they're ramping up, of providing courtesy violations. So they announce that the policy is effective November 1st, or on October 1st, they announce it's going to be effective November 1st. And during that 1 month period, they send courtesy violation notices that say, hey, what you're doing right now would be a violation under the policy, but it's not effective yet. So we're just letting you know so you can conform your behavior if you choose to do so. Then obviously when the policy goes active, you do what I call for real violation notices. Next. Another tool often overlooked are non-price restrictions. And what we mean by that is these things can help control channel conflict and price erosion. And they can also facilitate economic discrimination. And what I mean by that, economic discrimination, charging different prices to different customers. This is if you're a manufacturer. The Robinson-Patman says you have to treat competing customers alike. These are tools that allow you to decide who competes against whom and how much overlap there is. All of these are judged under the rule of reason, are very low risk, and the restriction types are customer, territorial, or market, or product. So for example, it is lawful, generally lawful, to tell a reseller who they can sell to and who they can't, where they can sell or where they can't, and what they can sell and what they can't. So you can restrict the kind of products that you make available to them. You can tell them to only sell certain kinds of customers. You may confine them to a territory, which could be geographic, or you could also confine them or ban them from selling online, or they're only allowed to sell online. So these are very powerful things that can be brought to bear. Next. It's important to carefully implement a policy. You have to avoid any kind of agreement on advertised or resale prices. There can't be any contracts that talk about this. You don't want people signing the policy saying, yes, I agree to follow it. You want no probation. And the way you get there is some training, which doesn't have to be detailed, and putting some guardrails in place with field people, even at headquarters, and using a policy administrator is key. Next. Step 4, implementing a policy and enforcing it. How do you sell it in? How do you make sure people understand it and they're ready for it? That could be both internally and internally. And then your enforcement alternatives, you don't want your sales force to be in a position of having to enforce the policy. That's not their job. Their job is to sell, not to beat people up. So that's why we want to put things into a separate policy administrator. And then secondly, you have to monitor for compliance. And you can use outside services like TrackStreet, or you can do self-monitoring, but you have to pay attention to what's going on. A supplement to monitoring is what one of our clients calls a snitch network. And that is all of our policies allow one reseller to rat out another and say, hey, look what this guy's doing across the street. The policy administrator takes in that information, investigates if it warrants a violation, one is followed. You never follow up with the one who complains saying, oh yeah, we took so-and-so to the woodshed. It's none of their business. Next. And then obviously over a period of time, you analyze and make adjustments to the policy. The goal is to get it right, or mostly right at the outset, but we also allow a lot of flexibility to make changes along the way without having to rewrite the policy. But sometimes you have to analyze or adjust for new developments, or there may be some features that really weren't necessary, or some things that have changed, and so they need to be added. So people say, well, how often do you have to update these policies? And what we've usually experienced is a number of our clients want them updated about 5 years after launch, but we've had some that go 10 years or longer before they're touched. Which is, fortunately, it shows that we drafted a good flexible policy at the outset. Next. Okay, so what are policy challenges? Next, the first one is putting these policies in place is really a long-term proposition, not short-term. You can't assume that you're just going to put something in place and all of a sudden all the problems are going to go away. And we have an issue sometimes where companies want instant action, and it just doesn't happen. It's a process. It takes a while. Next. And consistent with that are unrealistic expectations. Somehow this is going to solve all our problems. Well, in a lot of cases, while the problem manifests itself in an eroded price, it's really a distribution issue or a channel issue. There may be too many people selling the product or the wrong people selling the product. So keeping the expectations realistic are important. Next. Another one is whack-a-mole enforcement that really get a lot of people down, because it seems like they'll take action against a violator and then there's another one that crops up immediately, or the initial one changes its name and is back at it. Sadly, that's par for the course. So you have to tolerate some of that. And what a lot of our clients do is they shoot for a compliance at 90% plus. If they're doing 95% or more, they're really doing very well with their program. There'll always be some sort of noise in the background. And even with resellers complaining about price erosion or whatever, many or most of them understand that, hey, you're never going to get 100%. So you shoot for a high level. And by the way, there's often a sizable cost associated with moving from 95% to 98%, because now you really got to dig people out. And some companies want to do that. And Michelle specializes in digging people out and does it very well. Next. Dumb behavior with distributors. Next. For some of you, this may not be relevant since you don't use distributors or wholesalers, but we've seen situations where manufacturers expect distributors to enforce the supplier's policy, which is illegal, by the way. You can't do that. Another thing is manufacturers have oral policies. One of our clients is a trade association, and they polled their members who are distributors, and they asked them for copies of manufacturer policies, and they received several dozen of them. But a number of manufacturers said, oh yeah, we have a policy, but it's oral. If you have an oral policy, you don't have a policy. A vague policy. One of the classics is the GoPro policy. GoPro is delightfully short, but it's so incredibly vague you can drive a truck through it. They got away with it when they dominated the category. I don't know whether they can still getting away with the vagueness now that they have plenty of competition. Hard to use, do not sell lists. So when you cut somebody off and you've got a distributor, you've got to tell a back up. Thank you. When you cut somebody off, you have to tell them, you tell your distributors not to sell this particular reseller. And you commonly use a do not sell list. And some manufacturers provide them, they're really obtuse and they're hard to use. Inconsistent or unclear direction from the manufacturer, or wishy-washy enforcement by the supplier itself. All these things will cause all kinds of problems with distributors. Next. This is a topic of a whole different webinar, and that's Amazon. Amazon is constantly a challenge, whether it be their minimum margin agreements, whether it's their the pricing requirements, whether it's providing discounts that come out of the blue. Amazon's a real pain. And unfortunately, we don't have time to really get into it. But as I said, that's a separate topic as Amazon alone. But it's such a major factor, and it's forever causing problems. In fact, periodically, I send thank you notes to Amazon because it helps keep me in business. Next. Lack of resolve. And that is companies that put these policies in place with the best of intention, and then when push comes to shove, they just back off. The policy is going to fail, and it's not going to end well. Even if you're selective and you enforce against some people and not others, that creates some legal issues, but it'll become known that you just don't have the resolve and the policy will fall apart. It's better if a company doesn't have the commitment don't spend the time, money, or energy. Just don't go there. Try to solve the problem in another way. Next. We've seen the other problem, which is rigidity. These policies tend to be written by lawyers, and sometimes lawyers get so incredibly rigid that there's a one strike and you're out policy. You violate, and we shoot you in the head till you're dead. That doesn't work. And what happens is business people are so reluctant to use it because it's the atomic bomb approach. So a rigid policy is not the way to go either. Next. Another one is what we call myopia. Next. And myopia is you've got to look at the whole picture when you're doing these things. You can't overlook business and legal conflicts and friction. You really need to integrate your policy with your channel strategy, your trade spending and sales practices, your brand protection strategy, and you can't ignore unauthorized resellers. They tend to be the chronic policy violators. They tend to sell the wrong products in the wrong ways. You don't know who they are in all cases. There are limited remedies in terms of what you can do. The far better way to deal with unauthorized resellers is to stop them at the source, and that is controlling distribution, keeping products out of their hands rather than trying to solve the problem after the fact. If you're not careful about what you do in this area, next, this guy winds up becoming your reseller of the year. Next. Well, that sums it up, and we've got a little time left for questions, so feel free to submit them. In addition, for some of you getting a CLE credit, certain states require that we say a magic word, and then you should write it down, and we'll give you a post-course survey where you spit it back to us. Michelle, would you like to provide the magic word?
I would. It's my daughter's favorite food, so it's pizza. Okay,
so the magic word is pizza. In any event, this area is, it remains red hot to my surprise. This has gone on for a long, long time that there have been these concerns, and there seems to be new ones around the corner. And there are ways, many creative ways to deal with the problems. I think commitment is the first thing, and then designing and running good programs is another one. In any event, we'll open it up to questions. Michelle?
Now there's a Q&A, a question and answer little bubble in the navigation bar for the Zoom meeting. So if you have any questions that you wanted to submit, feel free to click on that and put your questions in the Q&A. I know one of the topics that come up often, oh, there's one. Never mind. We'll start here. Do C&D letters work against large, unprofessional, authorized sellers? Gene, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Our experience has been sometimes a cease and desist letter will get action that people will be scared off and they'll just stop. But either some of the really small ones or the ones that are, they've been through this before, they'll just blow it off. And, like, what are you going to do to me? You got to find me first, and you've got to go through these kinds of things. And particularly if a manufacturer doesn't have a track record of enforcement, there's a tendency to just blow things off. So in any event, sometimes they can work, but I wouldn't hold your breath. There's one other thing. It rarely happens, but it's possible. You send a C&D letter, and if you get somebody on the other side that's really got a bee in their bonnet, and they have substantial resources, they run to their local court, and they file something called the declaratory judgment action that says, hey, what we're doing isn't wrong. Then that forces you to come to their backyard and defend what you're doing. That doesn't happen very often. It happens more often like in trademark infringement matters or whatever, but that is one of the risks you take by sending a C&D letter. One other risk is once you send the letter, you told the other side that you know what they're doing is wrong. If you don't follow it up, after a period of time and it's not carved in stone, you've waived that violation, and you may waive all other violations because you knew about it and you haven't taken action. So that's another downside to C&D letters. We usually say it's a good place to begin, particularly if you plan on following it up with action afterwards. That doesn't mean litigation, but it may mean doing certain other things.
And I think another good point there too is if you can uncover the source as to where they're actually getting that product from and work with your distribution network to eliminate the distribution to that particular seller, it works a lot better.
Yeah, a perfect example of that is we had a client in the footwear area that couldn't understand why somebody selling online could just sell at dirt low prices, and they had no idea where they're getting the product. So they asked us to look into it, and we did some investigation. We found out that this online seller was buying returns from QVC. And once we closed off that avenue where those returns were no longer available, I think our client wound up buying them themselves or finding another outlet for them or whatever, then that online seller just withered and blew away. But that goes exactly to your point, Michelle.
Yeah. Let's see, our next question is the ratting out. Isn't that one of those no-nos, being it as a collusive action?
No, because we make it clear that we'll take complaints from others and we'll investigate them, but there's no agreement with the guy who complained that we're going to do anything about it, or that we've agreed with them on the price that the rator will sell at. And so if it's controlled, and let me just pause there. We've certainly seen cases where there are lawyers who believe, no, you can't even go there. You can't even do that. We've never had an issue. Again, you make it clear, we'll take the complaint. Thank you very much. We'll look into it, and if warranted, we'll take action. Never get back to the one who complained. Never have any agreement. That's what we do. And needless to say, there's a certain amount of noise. One of our clients surprised me by pointing out that he'd uncovered issues where he was getting complaints from resellers, and they had photoshopped online listings to make their competitors look bad. So obviously nothing happened because of that. But no, it's not collusive if done right.
Another question. With a unilateral MAP policy, would it run afoul of antitrust laws if you ask your authorized reseller to abide by the policy or otherwise correct an advertised price that violates the MAP?
Now here you have to walk a line, and you don't want any agreement on what those MAP prices are if you want a unilateral policy. So, and some have said, well, wait a minute, what about if in the 3 strike you're out scenario that I described, what if in the first strike, you're saying you send a notice that they're in violation and you give them a period of time to clean it up? Well, if they clean it up, I mean, haven't they agreed? And the answer is no. It's up to them whether they want to clean it up or not. And and you're not just providing a warning. Warnings tend to violate policies. It is a violation, and you're counting it as a violation against the total, because we see all violations as cumulative. So you're walking a fine line there, but no, you just say, hey, this is it, and we're giving you an opportunity. And if you choose not to take it, that's okay. Bad things happen to you. And if you do take it, fine. I should back up a little bit and say, strictly speaking, a 1 strike and you're out policy would probably be the strongest and the most conservative. Nobody wants 1 strike and you're out policies. And usually the pushback comes from the sales force. And why? Particularly if the sales force is compensated, at least in part, on volume, the last thing they want to do is being people off. And they want to maintain trade relations. So that's one of the reasons they're usually the driving force for multi-step violation structures, as opposed to just, 1 strike and you're out or whatever. But again, you've got to walk some fine lines here. But we think you're on firm ground if you do it properly, where you can still maintain having a unilateral policy.
This question kind of goes with that one. And it says, if in enforcement notices, if you state, please correct this within 48 hours, just for an example, or insert your consequence here, does this create an implied agreement with the reseller that could cause any issues?
No, it's the same issue. It's the same issue. You're giving them, what you're really saying, at least the way we set it up, is, look, you've got 48 hours to clean up this violation. And if you don't, your choice. But now it becomes a subsequent violation with a heavier penalty. And so, and the law is clear. Somebody complying with your policy has not reached an agreement with you. There's plenty of case law on that. So no, you don't have an issue with that, again, if it's done right. So you're giving people an out to say, as part of this, you have to clean it up. We're not agreeing on a price. You get your choice. Either you follow it or you don't.
Can you use your policy to ban sellers from listing certain products or all products on certain marketplaces like Amazon and eBay?
Yes. Yes. In fact, what we've done, this is evolved. We've been doing policies since, believe it or not, 1989, and have done hundreds of them. And where they've evolved is they've moved away from just price to we incorporate distributional restrictions, including things like saying it's a policy violation if you sell on websites that we don't approve or on websites that we disapprove. That's one that we've been including in an effort to control that. Now, there are other ways you can control it too. That's something you can put in a contract if you want, or you could have a separate distribution policy. But we incorporate a bunch of that stuff typically in our pricing policies because they're so important. But yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's a very good idea. You know, another one would be other kinds of restrictions. We ban resellers from selling for resale. They're only allowed to sell end users. Why? Because we cut somebody off. We don't want them getting supplied by another reseller. We ban them from, if it's important, from exporting. So they can only sell in the United States or only in the US and Canada. And they can't sell anyplace else. Why? Because it may mess up our distribution systems elsewhere. You know, particularly if there's arbitrage and the prices in the US are lower than they are in Europe or elsewhere. So anyway, you can incorporate a number of those kinds of things too. They don't need to be restricted just to price issues.
We have time for one final question, and I'm going to answer this one.
Good.
And that question is, do you offer additional webinars or counsel regarding Amazon? And Jean and I actually had this conversation earlier this week that we were thinking of putting together a whole series that talks about Amazon and some of the challenges specific to Amazon and MAP policies and unauthorized distributors that are selling on Amazon. So if we didn't get to your question today, we'd be happy to do so if you send us an email. Our contact information is on the screen. My information is michelle.daling@trackstreet.com. Jean's is Zelek@taftlaw.com. And we would be happy to follow up on any of these additional questions that we didn't have time for today. I wanted to remind you, for those of you that need a password to get your CLE credits for this course, that password is pizza. And we look forward to seeing you again on our next webinar. Thank you so much for attending today.
One last thing, apart from thanking everybody for participating and thanking Michelle for being a great host, everyone will receive a post-session survey. If you please fill that out, we appreciate it. We appreciate the feedback. And it's also key for those seeking continuing legal education credit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.